My guest is someone who has come from halfway around the world. He's Barry Eichengreen, Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of California at Berkeley. Well, Professor Eichengreen, thank you very much for joining us. You're of great interest at this point in time because Indian investors, like global equity investors, are very much interested in how President Trump's tax cut policies might pan out. The global risk on trade is contingent on this expectation. And therefore, first question, we saw that the health care bill was stalled in Congress quite unexpectedly. Does this delay tax cuts?
I think there will be an effort to accelerate tax cuts to regain political goodwill and confidence. But the fact of the matter is President Trump and people in the administration learned that healthcare reform is hard. I think they're about to learn now that tax reform is hard as well, and that it's likely to take considerably longer than the Treasury Secretary, who mentioned August as a deadline, anticipate.
Okay. Well, I was worrying whether tax cuts would get delayed because tax cuts would have been rendered revenue neutral if the healthcare bill could cut healthcare costs. But now that the healthcare bill is delayed, will that delay tax cuts?
That's exactly right. The failure of the healthcare economies makes individual income tax reform in particular more difficult. It's hard to cut individual tax rates at the top, in particular if you don't have another revenue source or another source of savings to point to, and that's what the Trump administration's version of healthcare reform seemingly promised. All of that makes me think that corporate tax reform is more likely to proceed than individual income tax reform, because corporate tax reform, the border adjustment tax, as it's referred to, could be done in a way that's revenue neutral.
Okay, then let me come to the border adjustment tax, because that's of even greater interest since it might push up the cost of imports into the United States. Are we really close to a border adjustment tax? How would you see it coming about?
I think a border adjustment tax which would levy, say, a 15 or 20% tax on all corporate revenues, with the exception of revenues derived from exports of merchandise. That idea is close to House Speaker Paul Ryan's heart. There are people in the Senate who like the idea as well. Trump has said mixed things about it, but one thing it does is to tax imports, and we know that the idea of taxing imports is near and dear to the president's heart. I do therefore think there is a plausible scenario where it comes about, although there will be furious lobbying around it and opposition from importers, from retailers, from a variety of other sectors.
Well, that's what I was coming to. If August is the deadline for tax reforms, then in 5 months, will all this opposition be placated? I mean, are American consumers ready to pay more for everything from textiles to gas?
American consumers are being told that they won't pay more, in part because the dollar will adjust to offset the effects of the import tax. So if imports are taxed at a 20% rate and the dollar strengthens by 20%, the cost of those goods remains unchanged. That is to say, if the exchange rate is well behaved, the change in the corporate tax system will be neutral from the point of view of consumers in different sectors. But the one thing we know about the exchange rate is that it's rarely well behaved. So I think this is a source of uncertainty that people will, including the markets, will begin to worry about.
Okay, so how might the world look in August of 2017 if we were to believe this deadline? Do you expect the border adjustment tax by then? Do you expect corporate tax adjustments by then? Do you expect a stronger dollar by then?
I do expect a stronger dollar because I think there are a number of forces that will be working to push the dollar up. The Fed is going to be raising interest rates. That makes for dollar strength. There may be a little bit of token infrastructure investment and a mix of looser fiscal policy together with tighter monetary policy will push the dollar up. If there is movement in the direction of a border adjustment tax, that will push the dollar up as well. And finally, if Trump resorts to tariffs, as he has threatened to do, that will be dollar positive among its other effects. So my worry is that the president and the Trump administration would prefer a weaker dollar because that would be good for the competitiveness of American manufacturing and for his efforts to bring good manufacturing jobs back to the United States. But everything he will be doing will be making for a stronger dollar. The president will be looking for the villain of the piece. Who is it out there that is frustrating his efforts to keep the dollar down? And I think the answer could be the Fed. So there's the possibility of tension, open conflict between the White House and the Fed. And number two, foreign governments, which the president and others may view as the culprit responsible for the strength of the dollar, the weakness of their own currencies.
Professor, we have to take a short break, but you've raised two important themes I want to discuss. Possible conflicts between the president and the US Fed and China. How will that pan out? All those questions to Professor Eichengreen after a very short break. Welcome back to our special conversation with Professor Barry Eichengreen, Professor of Economics and Politics at the University of California in Berkeley. Professor Eichengreen, China. Since you are a China expert, has the country or the economy been able to make that transition from being export dependent to one dependent on domestic consumption?
The Chinese economy is very large. It's like a super tanker that is hard to change its direction. So I think they are serious about rebalancing away from exports, away from excessive levels of investment toward domestic spending and the consumer sector in particular, but they're making only slow progress. So 5 years ago, consumption was about a third of the Chinese economy. Now it's maybe 40%. Consumption has been the fastest growing part of the Chinese national accounts, but starting from low levels. So they are making progress, but slowly. I think growth has come down to a healthier 6.5% from double-digit rates that were unsustainable. They are moving in the right direction. The central bank governor, Governor Zhou, last weekend made some statements about relying less on liquidity creation and money supply to keep the economy going. All those are good signs, but they don't. They're not processes that can be completed in short order.
Okay, but what about the Chinese rate of growth itself? Will it be able to deliver the 6.5 that was promised at the People's Congress?
Something close to 6.5. I think some people have been predicting a crash in China. I'm not among them. I think the Chinese economy is still enough of a controlled economy. It still has enough underlying strength that growth at a rate between 6 and 6.5% is entirely realistic.
You know, along with the promises of growth, the National People's Congress and the government promised a lot of other things like cutting down excess capacity. Does China normally deliver on all that? Would you expect them to lower their steel capacity by somewhat 150 million tons that was promised?
China has complicated politics, just like the US or India have complicated politics, although the complications are not always evident to the naked eye or to outsiders. So there are powerful local governments that own and operate companies in heavy industry with excess capacity that are pushing back against those reforms. I think the center has enough control over the process that they can continue to move in the direction of eliminating that excess capacity, but not quickly.
Just one more continent, and I want your view on global growth. Europe. Do you think Europe is done with quantitative easing, that hereafter, especially after what Draghi last said at the ECB meeting, should we be expecting slightly lower quantitative easing and finally probably even rate hikes before the year is done?
I don't think so. I think the European Central Bank learned from a very bad mistake it made in 2008 when it raised interest rates in the middle of the global financial crisis, because headline inflation, heavily affected by food prices and the like, was above its 2% target. If you look not at headline inflation but at core inflation with those volatile elements stripped out, inflation in Europe is still running at or below 1%. So I think it would be premature for the ECB to taper its securities purchases or to raise interest rates when it gets core inflation up to 2% next year. That might be the time.
Okay. Do you really think the euro is at risk in 2017?
I think the most likely scenario by far is that Le Pen loses in the second round of the French election system, where she will be running against a mainstream candidate, probably Macron, but whomever. But we were confident that we supposed experts that Hillary Clinton would win. We were confident that the Brits would vote no on Brexit. Yes. So those are reminders that we shouldn't rule anything out. I think Le Pen risk is a low probability event, but low probability events can happen. The other thing I would say is that we have some experience in Europe with radical populist politicians campaigning against the euro, and then when they're actually in power, like Alexis Tsipras in Greece, finding out that abandoning the euro will upset the markets and is more difficult than they thought. So even in the off chance that Le Pen were to win in the second round, I'm not predicting, but I'm imagining. One can also imagine her doing a volte-face and saying, I don't like the euro, but I've discovered I have to live with it.
Well, generally, would you believe that the global economy is finally found the holy grail of growth? This year, it might deliver perhaps the best growth in probably since the global financial crisis.
If nothing goes wrong. So I think that's right, that the U.S. economy is doing a bit better. We're at full employment. We're growing at potential. We have inflation right at the 2% target. Growth in Europe is picking up. Growth in Japan is picking up. And China is stable. India is doing pretty well. So if nothing goes wrong, this is a relatively rosy scenario, the best we've seen globally since before the crisis. But we have Trump risk, we have Marine Le Pen risk in Europe, we have a variety of geopolitical hotspots that could create problems. So if there are no accidents, 2017 could be okay. I'm not issuing any guarantees.
Yes, I noted your caveat. Let me go to the one question I left off when we shifted to China. The Fed and the independence of the Fed. Do you think the independence of the Fed is under threat? The Fed will buckle under it? How do you expect the Fed to behave? Not hike rates in spite of inflation data wanting such a rate hike?
I think the people currently on the Federal Reserve Board and the district reserve bank presidents who vote on monetary policy are all committed to the Fed's mandate, which includes the 2% inflation target, the price stability target. I don't think the current Fed would buckle under criticism from the White House, although I do fear that we're setting ourselves up for that kind of conflict between the White House and the Fed. But we could have a very different Board of Governors in a year. There are 2 openings now. By next month there will be 3 openings. By next year there could be 5 openings. So there could be an entirely different Federal Reserve Board, and indeed one in composition, unlike any that we've seen in the modern history of the Fed.
Okay. First, how many rate hikes, therefore, do you see this year at all? Left to itself, how much might the Fed hike?
The markets see another 2 or 3 coming this year, and I don't have any particular reason to second guess the markets. The economy is in a good spot, and a normal central bank would like to get interest rates back up toward normal levels. If nothing goes wrong, I think the U.S. economy can support 2 or 3 more 25 basis point rate increases. So I would remind you, these are relatively small increases, only 1/4 of 1% each time. The Fed learned from its taper tantrum mistake in 2013 about the importance of communicating clearly and preparing the markets for what's coming next. So I don't see why these modest rate increases would cause troubles for emerging markets or India, because they're much better communicated in advance than was the case 4 years ago.
How do you mean the Fed will look very different? This Fed has probably given enough evidence that it is dovish and concerned about the impact of its rate hikes. It's been very slow and very communicative about its hikes. If anything, it can be faulted for bringing hikes later than it ought to have, some would say. How would the new Fed look like? Will it be more hawkish or more dovish?
Well, there's some people who say this Fed has been too dovish, and other people equally who say it's been too hawkish. And I take that to suggest that it's been neither too hot nor too cold, but just about right. It's been the Goldilocks Fed. What the Federal Reserve Board might look like in the age of Trump, where he can appoint a majority, a large majority of the board? The simple answer is we don't know. And there's been no consistency in his appointments. He likes to appoint businessmen to cabinet positions. So it's been a while since we've had industrialists, business leaders, really since the 1970s running the Fed. We could be going back to that. Will he appoint generals to the Board of Governors? I think his pattern has typically been to appoint a mainstream figure and a crazy figure, radical and a mainstream figure, and let them battle it out. So we could see a Fed with that composition, a divided Fed.
Well, yes, I take your point. It's difficult to guess the color of the Fed, but I have a few more questions about India. Just stay on with us. We have to take a quick break and we are back. Welcome back to our special conversation with Professor Barry Eichengreen, Professor of Economics and Politics at the University of California in Berkeley. Professor Eichengreen, let me come to India. What's your sense about the demonetization experiment we did? We seem to have got away with minor bruises. You don't think it's a catastrophe?
Right. So I've been asked, do I think this was a catastrophic event? And I look at the growth figures. From the point of view of the growth of the economy as a whole, it seems to have been more of a hiccup than a road accident. I do think it's unfortunate that it hit poor people disproportionately, the cash economy, which means poor people in rural areas, and that strengthens the argument for the government to do more for the people who were hit directly. Some of the dislocations were unavoidable because you can't pre-announce that kind of cash conversion. You can't set up arrangements with banknote printing companies in advance without the secret getting out. So it wasn't smooth, but those kind of events which are designed to deal with problems of corruption and dark money and so forth cannot be smooth by definition.
Yes, we do hope it was worth the effort. What's your sense about the other big problem that the financial system faces, which is default loans, bad loans that corporate banks have? Some people have suggested that you put in a bad bank, but that comes with problems of capitalizing and buying up loans at market rates. Is that a good idea?
I think the bad bank model is one that has been proven to work in a variety of cases where there's a legacy problem of non-performing loans. The Chinese approach is to try to grow out of the problem by continuing to grow for a period of years at 6, 7, 8%. I think it's better to attack the problem head on with a bad bank kind of structure if you can get the political will to do it.
Yes, that really is the problem. So much of buying up of bad assets is seen as cronyism, and that's stymieing the effort. Finally, do you think this entire transition of the global political economy, as it were, or even global politics, from globalization and liberalism towards probably isolationism and rightism, will be smooth, or are there lurking red flags which we are not able to see now?
I'm not sure I even buy the proposition that we're unavoidably moving toward a more protectionist, isolationist world. That idea is premised on the notion that unhappy American voters don't like globalization, and that Mr. Trump will protect them against what they don't like. If he doesn't deliver what he promises, which is good jobs for American workers, I don't think protectionism will do that. Workers are going to look for another option. And I think if the mainstream parties in the United States, the Democrats, and mainstream parties in other countries can promise growth with equity, which is what it's all about. We ignored the equity part for too long. Then I think there is hope for globalization, and for countries like India that very much rely on the existence of an open global economy.
Okay, let's hope it works out that way. Professor Eichengreen, thank you very much for joining me in this conversation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.